Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Contra 4, a two-dimensional third-person run-and-gun platforming title, developed by WayForward Technologies and published by Konami Digital Entertainment for the Nintendo DS console in 2007, with ports to other mobile platforms in the years following its release. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving into Contra 4, I thought it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why the heck I chose to play Contra 4 for this episode of the podcast. So let me go a little bit back. This is actually, I guess I first played Contra 4, I want to say 6-7 months ago. And at the time, I was looking for a reason to play on my Nintendo DS. So I have a ton of consoles. I've talked about that in various episodes of the podcast and our Patreon feed. I've got a ton of different consoles. But because of convenience, sometimes I just don't pick up the console to actually play the games that I play for the majority of the podcast. Most of the time I'm emulating. Now, early on in the podcast's life, I did try to, wherever possible, play every single game on its original hardware because I thought that was the most authentic experience and that was what I really wanted to get across. As the podcast continued to grow and as timing started to become a little bit more of an issue, I started to lean more towards convenience, which meant I wanted to play something that was just convenient. I could fire it up on my computer or whatever and just play the game, which is why emulation has become much more of a focus for me as I've gone through a lot of these episodes over the past few years. But I still own a lot of these consoles, and sometimes you just feel like playing on real hardware. So around 6-7 months ago, that's exactly the way I was feeling. I wanted to play something on my Nintendo DS. And I was sitting there, and I have one of those flash carts that have multiple games on it that I can pick and choose whatever the heck I want to play. And I'm scrolling through the games, and at the time, my son was sitting next to me. He had just turned 4 years old. So he's sitting next to me, and I'm kind of talking to him, saying, hey, buddy, what game do you want to play, or what game would you want to see on the system? And he is not really into console gaming at this point. He's still not really into it even today, but he was sitting there and we're scrolling through the list and he saw a big C on the list of games, on the icon within the game list. And I looked at it and immediately for me, I knew that big C was Contra. Now, I had never played a Contra game on the Nintendo DS, but I thought, what the heck, Contra is a great game. I did a whole episode on the original Contra a couple years ago, so why not? Let's fire up Contra and see what it's like. So I said, okay, let's do it. Fired up Contra, and immediately I see everything about this game, about Contra 4, which is what it was listed as. Everything about Contra 4 felt like it was a remake of the original game. It had a similar kind of opening, albeit with much higher quality audio. If you go into the game and you play the very first mission of the game, it is literally the jungle level of the first Contra game, which is pretty iconic. I think there's probably a ton of people that have played that initial jungle level in the original Contra game. Whether you got past that level and actually beat the game or not, that's another question, or whether you use the Konami code or not, that's another question. But the fact is that that first level is pretty iconic. So as soon as I saw it, As soon as I saw the jungle level pop up on the screen, I thought to myself, oh, I guess Contra 4 must be a remake or a remaster of the original Contra. So I thought to myself, this is going to be something that has very little amounts of commitment required to it. Because if I'm not sitting down to play a game for the podcast, I want something that I can kind of get up and go. I can pause it. I can go do something else. I'm not really looking for commitment a lot of the time. I'm looking for something to pass the time. And I thought, okay, a remake of the original Contra? That certainly fits the bill. I'll just play it when I want to play it. If my son wants to take a look at it and watch me play it for a little bit, cool. It'll be a fun little experience, but nothing that requires all that much commitment. Then, though, I realized as I started playing the game, this isn't a remake at all. Even though a couple of the levels look very similar, even though some of the music sounds very similar, as I'm playing the game, it dawned on me, this isn't a remake of the original Contra. This is a totally different game. Not to mention the fact that the unique controls or the unique aspects of the Nintendo DS added additional mechanics, which we'll talk through later on in the episode. But just the entire game was very, very different. And I did not expect that when I sat down to begin playing the game. As I'm playing it, I'm starting to think to myself, oh, this is an entirely different Contra experience. So at that point, I decided to myself, well, hey, if this is a retro game, it's a Contra game. And it seems to be a pretty darn good Contra game, at least based on my initial impression. I thought to myself, well, hey, I might as well do an episode on Contra 4. So that the original thought around no commitment suddenly became a defined commitment, because then I decided I am going to play Contra 4 for a future episode of the podcast. I started playing the game. I started to devour it the way you have to with Contra games, because they require very high amounts of concentration and memorization in order to eventually beat the game. So I'm playing the game. I'm getting engaged in the game. I'm really liking it. I'm going well beyond that first play session with my son to really start to understand the ins and outs of Contra 4. And then I start to do some research about the history of Contra 4, which is typically what I do. A lot of times I'll look at the history before I start playing the game, but in this instance, I figured, well, what the heck? I was playing the game first. I'll look at the history. I'll start to develop that knowledge so that I'll be able to relay all of my research to everyone that's listening to the episode. So I started to research Contra 4, and I noticed something immediately, which took me a little bit aback. It turns out Contra 4 was a 2007 release. Now, some of you may be aware that I have set an arbitrary 20-year guideline as far as what constitutes a quote-unquote classic game, meaning any game that I cover on the podcast has traditionally been a game that's over 20 years old. 20 years old or older has been the cutoff for games that I cover here. Now, this year, I'm doing things a little bit different because I do have some of those old is new kind of episodes that we're going to be looking at, like the Crimson Diamond, where it's actually a brand new modern game, but it's designed in a retro kind of style. So we are starting to branch off a little bit from that, but I did not intend at all to cover a real quote-unquote retro game that was not 20 years old. So as I sat there, and at this point, I was deep into Contra 4. I sat there and I thought to myself, oh, what do I do? What do I do? I literally had a psychological kind of discussion with myself. Oh man, what do I do? Do I hold this off? Do I play the game? Do I do the episode? Do I not release it for another year and a half so that I don't release it till 2027 so that I maintain that 20-year purity that I've been kind of working through with the rest of the podcast? I went back and forth with myself for a while. And then I decided this is my podcast. I can define the rules myself. I don't have to keep that arbitrary rule. Now, I will say I am going to try to keep that rule wherever possible. It's not like that rule is going out the window. But occasionally you play a game and it doesn't fit into the rules, in which case you have to decide, do you stick with the rules or do you do something else? In this case, I decided to do something else, which is exactly why we are playing Contra 4 for today's episode. Now, the thing that really was on my mind as I was playing Contra 4, as I was going through the game, I needed to know, could this modern, so to speak, reimagining of an old school Contra capture the feel of the original? And even further than that, could I actually beat the game without resorting to the helpful but ultimately cheat-centric Konami code? As many people know, that Konami code, the up, down, down, left, right, BA start, has been a staple of many Konami games. Back in the original Contra, it gives you 30 lives to play through the game, which is a godsend when you're trying to learn the game. Eventually, I did beat Contra without using that code. The question in my mind was, could I do the same with Contra 4? Or would Contra 4 actually defeat me? Contra 4 is a two-dimensional third-person run-and-gun platforming title developed by WayForward Technologies and published by Konami Digital Entertainment for the Nintendo DS back in 2007, with ports to other mobile platforms in the years following its release. Before we can talk about Contra 4, we need to take a step back and talk about the evolution of the Contra series, a run-and-gun shooter kind of experience that has evolved over time, starting with the original Contra back in the 80s and advancing all the way through our game of the day, Contra 4, and then a little bit beyond that even to today. We're going to talk about all of that in a little bit. But first, we need to touch upon the evolution of the run-and-gun shooter, because before we can talk about Contra, it's essential to understand the evolution of the run-and-gun genre itself, which did emerge from two primary different styles of games: twin-stick shooters and side-scrolling shooters. Now, before we continue, I should mention that we covered the history of the overall evolution of those genres quite a bit when we had our discussion on the original Contra back all the way in episode number 31, which at this point is almost 3 years ago, which is kind of crazy to think about. So my intent is not to rehash or reiterate all of that here, but I do want to give a little bit of perspective, because as we talk about the overall Contra series, it's important to understand where the series got its start. So let's start by talking about the twin-stick shooter kind of experience. Most twin-stick shooters, as the name implies, use two different joysticks, one for movement and one for aiming or shooting around the screen. Now, the earliest twin-stick shooters featured single-screen gameplay coupled with a bunch of different enemy waves, weapon power-ups, and obstacles. Before we get to the overall twin-stick shooters that we probably know and love today, things like Smash TV, we had a lot of different games that kind of toyed around with the concept of twin-stick shooting without actually being a traditional twin-stick shooter kind of experience. So the twin-stick shooter, you can kind of trace its history and origins all the way back to 1975, which is when a game named Gunfight, otherwise known as Western Gun, was created by Taito Midway over in the arcades. This is one of the earliest examples of what many people consider to be a twin-stick shooter. This one featured human-on-human combat, which was one of, if not the first game to ever introduce human violence in a video game. But it featured human versus human combat in a Western duel kind of experience with destructible cover. So the way the game worked is you would kind of navigate around the screen, you would hide behind different cover, and by hide behind, I mean literally move your character behind different pieces of scenery or objects within the overall game world. You would try to shoot your opponent before your opponent could shoot you. This was probably the first example of a quote-unquote twin-stick shooter. It was pretty darn popular for years, maybe because of its twin-stick shooter gameplay, but most likely because this was one of the first times, if not the first time, that human versus human gameplay was depicted on an arcade screen. This wasn't all about pixely vehicles or other kinds of objects. It was human versus human, and as we know from games that have evolved beyond this point, that kind of thing does tend to sell. Gunfight was followed up by Boot Hill in 1997, which is another Midway Taito game. It's effectively a sequel to Gunfight. This one added AI-controlled enemies. So rather than just having a 1 versus 1 kind of experience where you needed 2 players to play the game, Boot Hill included artificial intelligence enemies. In the process, this made it so that solo players could actually play the game. But it also was a bit less successful than Gunfight. Now we go to 1979 next, which is when Sheriff, which was one of Nintendo's earlier arcade titles, came out on the scene. This one isn't a real twin-stick shooter because it doesn't actually use twin sticks. This one had a joystick for moving around, but it actually used a spin dial for aiming. So rather than moving 2 joysticks, one of which you moved your character around, the other which you would aim around the screen, this one used a little bit of a dial or a spinner, so to speak, where you'd be able to aim by spinning that dial either up or down or left or right or whatever, and then you would aim on the screen. It did, however, introduce many of the core mechanics for the genre, which is the ability to aim in multiple directions and fire. This game is also fairly important because it also represented the first time that art by Shigeru Miyamoto, who is the Nintendo legendary designer that we all know today. This was the first game that we found art from Miyamoto, and basically it set him on his path to becoming a very well-known video game designer, and also set Nintendo on its path to becoming a world-renowned video game publisher and developer. Now, if we fast forward a little bit to 1982, that's when Williams released Robotron 2084. This was a major leap forward in the twin-stick shooter genre. It introduced a fully realized twin-stick experience with multiple waves of different enemies, unique obstacles to progress around and avoid, and different mechanics, setting the stage for future twin-stick shooters like Smash TV and Total Carnage later in the 80s and early 90s. Now, I did mention earlier that twin-stick shooters are only one part of the overall formula that would eventually birth Contra and all of its sequels. The other style of game that would play a part in Contra's development was the side-scrolling shooter. Now, I know, when you think about Contra, you're going to say, well, wait a second, that's a side-scrolling shooter in and of itself. So how can the side-scrolling shooter genre have been a part of the creation of Contra? Isn't it just one and the same? And the fact is, no, not quite, because when we're talking about side-scrolling shooters from the earliest stages or the earliest eras of video games, we're not really talking about games like Contra. We're talking about games like Williams' 1980 Defender, which introduced a continuous scrolling world rather than a static screen. Now, this was huge because a lot of arcade games around this time were single screen kinds of experiences. You were literally confined to a single screen worth of gameplay. Some games allowed you to progress from that one screen onto other screens within the game world, either by navigating to the left or the right of the screen or the top or the bottom of the screen, which would then load, once again, another single screen. But none of them really had, or not many, had actual scrolling gameplay where it felt like you were navigating a real world. Defender revolutionized the concept of not just having a static screen, but also having the ability to scroll around a game world. Now, this was an early implementation of such an experience. Players would control a spaceship, and you could move in all directions to rescue humans and defeat an alien menace. This was a massive departure from previous arcade experiences, and it would inspire a ton of different future titles. Defender itself was kind of primitive, certainly by today's standards, but back then, back when it came out in 1980, it was revolutionary, and the feeling of navigating across a game world and continuing to move forward, even if the game world itself repeated on itself, so it's not like it was a huge game world, but basically you would move around and it would revolve around itself, so to speak. But regardless, Defender was a big deal. That would then spawn a bunch of different games, either those that were directly inspired by Defender or those that would try to evolve the state of the overall Defender style shooter. One of those games was a game called Scramble back in 1981 by Konami. That game, Scramble, would build upon Defender's mechanics. It introduced a constantly scrolling world with mission-driven gameplay and environmental obstacles. So think about it like this. Defender, you could move in any direction, and if you moved to the left or the right, the game world would naturally scroll with you. Scramble was a little bit different. This was an auto-scrolling kind of experience, so it wasn't like you controlled your ability to move forward or backwards in the game world. You were moving forward. That was basically all that was happening, and you were basically required to navigate that game world, avoid obstacles, and defeat enemies. So a little bit of a different experience. This was one of the earlier auto-scrolling kinds of side-scrolling shooters. It would become Konami's first global arcade hit, so Scramble was definitely a big deal. Konami itself would follow Scramble up with another game, Gradius, in 1985. Gradius was originally intended to be a direct sequel to Scramble, but the fact is, Gradius took the overall mechanics from Scramble and ran a million miles down the line because Gradius was such an evolution over the experience that Scramble provided. Gradius would introduce deep level design, a ton of different enemy variety, and a power-up system, which would become a huge deal in future shooters. Gradius was one of the most influential shooters of all time. And even beyond the mechanics being an influence for future games, it would also influence future Konami games because it was the first game to feature the Konami code. The Konami code is something that most people who have grown up throughout the 80s probably have memorized. It's the old up, up, down, down, left, right, BA start kind of code, which in games like Contra would give you 30 additional lives, making your playthrough dramatically easier. Interestingly, the Konami code was not originally thought of as a way to give players a little bit of an assist while playing Konami games. Instead, the Konami code was originally featured as a debugging tool that, for whatever reason, was not removed from the game prior to it being published. That tool, so to speak, would become one of the most famous cheat codes in video game history. And with that, the Konami code was born and would make its way into a number of Konami titles in the future, and would even make its way into a number of other games not created by Konami as an homage to that incredibly influential cheat code. So, with the early history of the side-scrolling shooter, as well as the twin-stick shooter, we have all of the elements in place to birth an entirely new genre, or at least an evolution of those two genres merged together. That would be the run-and-gun shooter. Konami would take elements from both of the genres we just talked about, the side-scrolling shooter as well as the twin-stick shooter, and would create a singular game that would combine both of those elements into a very different kind of experience. You might think that would be Contra, but no, we're not there quite yet. The first game that Konami would tackle to really combine all of those elements together was a game named Russian Attack, or Green Beret, that was released back in 1985. This was one of the first side-scrolling run-and-gun titles, though calling it a run-and-gun title is a little bit of a misnomer because most of the time when you're playing Russian Attack, you're actually playing melee battle with the knife. There are a couple of weapons in there that allow you to fire them, but for the most part, Russian Attack was not about shooting. It was really about all the stabby-stabby kind of stuff that would come along with using a knife. That being said, Russian Attack did have a number of fans. But the next game that Konami worked on in this whole run-and-gun shooter kind of new genre is the one that would take the entire gaming world by storm. That was, of course, the 1986 release of Contra. Contra would build upon Russian Attack and would perfect the run-and-gun formula, blending fluid movement, platforming, cooperative multiplayer, and a mix of side-scrolling and vertical levels. And in the process, it would become one of the most beloved action games of all time. With this evolution and with the overall evolution of twin-stick shooters, side-scrolling shooters, and their combination, Contra emerged as the defining run-and-gun experience in the world. It combined the best elements of both shooter subgenres into something that gamers had never really experienced before. With the release of Contra, there was a demand to have more games like Contra. So Konami said, you know what? We're going to do just that. And that started up the build for what would eventually become the Contra gaming series. So let's talk about the Contra lineage. Let's talk about the overall evolution of Contra as a video game franchise. First, you have the original Contra, which, like we talked about, was originally conceptualized in 1986. It would release in the arcades, the NES, and a bunch of other platforms around that time. It was the first game in the series and would introduce the world to the unique blend of various features that represent what Contra is all about. That meant weapon power-ups, side-scrolling, vertical scrolling, and behind-the-shoulder perspective levels. There were a huge variety of levels within the original Contra. You could have your traditional, at least now, traditional side-scrolling run-and-gun kind of level. Or you might be having to climb up a mountain, so to speak, by going vertically instead of horizontally. The biggest departure, though, was the over-the-shoulder level, and there were a couple in the original Contra, where you were basically in a military base, and it presented a pseudo over-the-shoulder 3D kind of perspective. This was not true 3D, but it was certainly close enough to make the game feel dramatically different than what other games might have felt. Now, one of the biggest things with the original Contra, and something that would make its way into the rest of the series, is the fact that in Contra, you have the concept of one-hit kills. You did not have a life bar. If you got hit by an enemy, or an enemy projectile, or you fell off the screen, or you did any number of bonehead things, you would die and lose a life. Contra did come out in the arcades originally, and it was a fairly successful quarter muncher. But the biggest release in Contra history would be when it came out on the Nintendo Entertainment System, because that is the system and that is the release that would really put Contra on the map. Now, it did have to make some concessions because the arcades, as we've talked about in prior episodes of the podcast, arcades were dramatically more powerful than home consoles. They had entire cabinets dedicated to gaming hardware that could deliver the best, the biggest, the most graphically impressive and sounding titles in the world. When you try to convert that into a small entertainment box that sits underneath your television, concessions would have to be made. The graphics would have to drop down from the arcade-styled visuals to more of an 8-bit kind of style. Sound and audio quality would also be degraded a bit as it moved over to the NES. The overall stages in the game had to be changed. You couldn't have these wide, expansive levels because the NES simply couldn't handle that kind of thing. Even though all of these concessions had to be made, the NES version would end up being the iconic version of the original Contra experience. And I dare you to ask anybody on the street that might have some video game knowledge what their special version or what their favorite version of Contra would be. And I've got to imagine the majority of them are going to say the NES version. I can certainly say that about myself. The NES version of Contra from way back when I was younger, that is the version of the game. And even though Contra would maintain an arcade presence for at least a good portion of its early lineage, the real focus of Contra and the ones that I experienced personally, they were all on home consoles. So Contra itself, released back in 1986, 1987, depending on what platform you're talking about, huge success, especially on the NES. That would spawn a direct sequel, which was called, well, it was called Super Contra, because how can you make something even better than the original? You attach a superlative to the beginning of the name, which is why we got Super Contra in 1988. This was another release that came out on the arcades, as well as the Nintendo Entertainment System and a bunch of other platforms. This was very similar to the original Contra. It did release first in the arcades before it made its way to the home market, most prominently, just like with Contra, the NES. On the NES, the game wasn't actually released until 1990. When it came out on the NES, it was no longer named Super Contra. It would be renamed as Super C. And in the process, it would gain several additional levels to make the game even more action-packed than its arcade predecessor. So we just talked about the fact that arcades in general were the definitive gaming experiences available in the 80s to the early 90s. Well, Super Contra, as it translated over to the NES, would actually be enhanced. Not necessarily in terms of graphics or audio. From that perspective, the arcades still ruled. But from the perspective of the overall gameplay experience, Super C, as the Super Contra title would be named on the NES, would actually be enhanced with additional levels, making the home experience an even better experience than what many people had played at the arcades. Super C, though, even though it was a new game, even though it had additional gameplay elements, it was effectively more of the same. There were some slight tweaks beyond the original NES Contra formula, though. So as an example, The fireball power-up was changed, including the ability to now charge the weapon. So you had a charge attack in Super C. The behind-the-shoulder levels that I talked about from the original Contra, that style of level was replaced entirely with a sort of tops-down perspective set of stages, which interestingly was similar in some ways to twin-stick shooters, because in twin-stick shooters, a lot of times those games would have a tops-down kind of perspective. Super C would take that formula and apply it to the Contra formula, making it even closer to some of its heritage. But most importantly, Super C would not have the Konami code, which is crazy because I always thought, and granted, I haven't played every single Contra game, but I always assumed if you were going to sit down and play a Contra game, that Konami code was going to be available for you to use. Super C did not have the Konami code, which was crazy to me. I did not realize that was the case. There was a code, though, for extra lives, which was right, left, down, up, A, B, start, or select start if you're playing 2 players. But in the NES version, you would only get 10 lives, whereas on the Famicom version over in Japan, you would get 30 lives, which I've got to say, what the heck is going on with that? Why would the American or the international version of the game only get 10 lives, whereas in Japan you would get 30 lives? What's going on there, Konami? I don't know what you're doing, but that doesn't sound really fair to me. Regardless of that fact, Super C was very well received, and for many players, Super C was even better than the original Contra. This was a more definitive kind of Contra experience. Super C would be followed up in 1991 with Operation C for the Nintendo Game Boy. So this was another iteration on the Contra formula, but this time it could fit in your pocket. It was very similar to Super C. There were some traditional side-scrolling levels and some tops-down shooting levels, but it would also introduce the ability to hold down the shoot button for rapid fire. Now, that's not quite as efficient as rapidly pressing the buttons yourself, but it is still useful and also results in less repetitive stress injuries than just continuing to hammer on a button. The interesting thing about Operation C, though, is that it would introduce a brand new power-up to the Contra formula, that being the homing shot. One of the other cool features of the game was the ability to upgrade your spread shot weapon from the traditional 3-shot variant to 5 shots, which was the first time in a Contra game where any weapons could be directly upgraded by picking up the same version of that weapon. Though it did only work with the spread shot, which I've got to question why it would only work with that particular weapon. Now, that being said, the spread shot is by far the best weapon in any run and gun shooter game, and I will fight anyone to the death if you ever claim otherwise. Not really, I'm more of a nice guy. But the spread shot is an incredibly good weapon. I love the spread shot. So I get the fact that they were trying to upgrade this particular weapon, but I do question why there weren't upgrades for other weapons in the game. This one did include the Konami code, but the Konami code for Operation C didn't give you 30 lives. It simply unlocked the stage select for the NES version. That stage select, by the way, was available by default in the Famicom version of the game, which, once again, I don't know why that would be. And there was yet another different special code for additional lives. You would press up, 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 down, 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 left, 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 and start, which would get you 9 lives in the North American version of the game. The Japanese version of the game would use the traditional Konami code for extra lives. Once again, a little bit of a shift between the Japanese version of the title and the North American and other international region of the title. Regardless of those differences, Operation C was another great Contra release. That one would be followed up by a Contra release on a brand new system, that being the Super NES, the 16-bit giant by Nintendo in 1992, which was Contra 3: The Alien Wars. This was the first home console 16-bit version of Contra. It would feature dramatically better visuals and audio than prior home Contra titles. In fact, it would start to approach arcade quality from those original Contra games. And actually, as the development team was creating Contra 3, they would often ask for feedback from the original Contra arcade team, as that team was developing Contra 3, which itself would then lead to a more arcade-like experience. The goal for Contra 3: The Alien Wars was to take all of the action of the past Contra games and turn it up to 11. There were a ton of iterations on the traditional Contra formula as well as some enhancements. So with Contra 3, you would earn the ability to hold 2 different weapons and swap between them, which was a major change to the overall Contra formula. There would also be rideable vehicles like tanks and a ton of different stages that would use vehicles and other traversal mechanisms to get around. Here, the tops-down stages that were prevalent in Super C as well as Operation C could now take advantage of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics system, which allowed for sprite scaling and rotation beyond what any other home console had been able to do up to that point. It would also introduce the Crush Weapon power-up, which was a strong missile attack that would make its way into future Contra titles. You'd also be able to move around different environmental objects and hold onto the environment, whether that was a girder hanging above you or any other number of things that you can grab onto as you're traversing different levels. The way the game was designed is that every 3 screens worth of scrolling, something interesting was supposed to happen. The thought was that by making all of these levels action-packed and interesting, the gameplay would remain super action-oriented and would make players absolutely love the experience. I mean, at one point, just to paint a picture or give an example, at one point in Contra 3, you even ride on a bunch of missiles that are firing across the screen, jumping back and forth between them. If that doesn't scream over-the-top action, I honestly don't know what does. This was, by the way, another instance where the Japanese version of the game is easier than the international version, as the Japanese version would have unlimited continues, as well as allowing players to fight the final boss even during a normal difficulty playthrough, instead of needing to select hard to see the true final boss, which is the way the international version of the game was designed. This one did not feature the Konami code, though there were several codes included in the Japanese version of the game, including one for 30 lives. But if you look at the international release, there were no codes available, which once again screams, what the heck? Why was the international version being made so much more challenging than the Japanese release? I don't know the answer to that question other than assuming that it was because of the video game rental market and trying to get as many dollars as possible from those rentals. But regardless, Contra 3 was incredibly well received. It is considered by many to be one of the best console games of all time. Not just one of the best Contra games of all time, one of the best console games ever released. With Contra 3, you might assume that the very next Contra release would be another 16-bit title. Only here, you would be wrong, as there was an NES-only in 1992 Contra release called Contra Force, which was designed to be a spin-off of the Contra series. Interestingly, this one was very different than the traditional Contra-styled formula. You had a character select, each with different abilities and specialties, which was a good idea and added an additional layer of complexity to the overall Contra gameplay experience. But the upgrade system here worked very differently, and the game had an intense slowdown. I mean, this was very much a game that was pushing the boundaries or tried to push the boundaries of the NES, but would slow down the system so much that the game became an almost awful kind of gameplay experience. Not many people enjoyed Contra Force. And as you're playing Contra Force, you might assume that you would be fighting the same alien menace as all of the other Contra games. Not so in Contra Force. You were fighting an entirely different set of enemies. This game is effectively Contra in name only. And I will admit that I have not personally played this one, but it is so different in so many ways, and the reviews for the game, as well as the general feedback about the game's changes, are so bad that I honestly don't feel the need to give this one a go. If anybody has played it, or you have any particular love for Contra Force, definitely let me know, but everything that I have seen suggests to me that this is one that's probably better avoided. I also want to mention that, like we talked about, this was not well received by the broader critical community, and that means that Contra Force was the first Contra franchise title to not be beloved and critically praised by literally everyone. Well, maybe not literally, but by figuratively everyone across the gaming landscape. Luckily for everybody, Contra Force would remain just a little spin-off off to the side that not many people talk about today, because in 1994, Contra Hard Corps would release for the Sega Genesis. If we put aside the oddity that was Contra Force, Contra Hard Corps would actually be influenced just a little bit by that spin-off game, because Contra Hard Corps would include itself a character select screen where players could select between 4 different characters. Beyond that, Contra Hard Corps would also evolve the traditional Contra formula. With this game, there would be only side-scrolling stages. There were no tops-down stages, there were no behind-the-shoulder stages in this one. There were cutscenes, though, in between levels, which was a nice touch, because now there was a real story in a Contra game. It even featured branching paths that would change which levels you could play based on your decisions, which was a really cool idea. There were also some movement mechanics added to the game, like the ability to slide around the screen, as well as attack from that slide. And even beyond that, now you could carry 4 weapons at a time and swap between them. The one thing that Contra Hard Corps did very similarly to many of its prior titles was the fact that the overall gameplay and design was incredibly challenging, at least in North America. The Japanese version was made much easier, and some of these changes were really dramatically different than what even the whole Contra formula would suggest. As an example, in the Japanese version of Contra Hard Corps, there were no more one-hit kills. In the Japanese version, you could take 3 hits before dying, which is so different than what I would expect from a Contra game that I've got to question what Konami was thinking, number 1, with putting that in the game, but number 2, also restricting it to the Japanese version only. It would also have unlimited continues, which just makes me question again, what the heck's going on here, Konami? Because the American version of the game, I've got to tell you, was not that easy. This one did not feature the Konami code, though there were a bunch of other codes to make the gameplay easier, at least in the Japanese version of the game. In the North American version, Contra Hard Corps would be much more challenging, but despite that intense difficulty, critics and players loved this game. And if you talk to many Contra players and you ask them what their favorite Contra game of all time was, you may get a ton of responses that suggest Contra Hard Corps is the game to beat. This was yet another strong Contra title in an almost never-ending parade of strong titles. With that 16-bit release, so you had a couple of 16-bit releases, one on the Super NES, one on the Sega Genesis, you might assume that the next logical leap for Contra was to make its way onto even newer video game consoles, like the Sony PlayStation. And if you guessed that the next Contra game would in fact come out on the PlayStation, you would be right, as 1996 saw the release of Contra: Legacy of War. Interestingly, this was the first Contra title developed by a company other than Konami. This was created by Appaloosa Interactive. Perhaps their most well-known creation, if you don't recognize that name, Appaloosa Interactive, their most well-known creation was probably Echo the Dolphin and the series of games that would be associated with Echo the Dolphin. But they also worked on a number of ports for various companies in the past, including King's Quest V for the NES, Castlevania for the Amiga, and the Simpsons arcade game for the Commodore 64 and MS-DOS computer platforms. Appaloosa Interactive wasn't the biggest name in the world, but they did have an opportunity to wow gamers with their unique take on the Contra formula. This would be the first Contra title that would spring into 3 dimensions using the power of the Sony PlayStation console. You might be wondering how that turned out. And the answer to that is, well, not quite as great as Appaloosa Interactive had hoped. This is another one that I have not personally played, but in the eyes of many, this game, Legacy of War, was simply not Contra. A lot of reviewers who played the game actually claimed that the game would have been better received if it wasn't labeled as a Contra title. It just felt too different. Some people even said, if you want to play an actual good Contra game, just fire up your old consoles and have at it, because this just wasn't it. Putting aside the harshness of those critiques, this would not stop Konami from giving Appaloosa Interactive one more try, which is what led to C, the Contra Adventure for the PlayStation in 1998. This one was still a 3D experience, but they mixed it up by including a selection of side-scrolling levels, similar to the original standout Contra titles on Nintendo's and Sega's 8 and 16-bit systems. Appaloosa Interactive really tried with this one. They tried so hard to make a Contra game that would appeal to gamers. But no, this one failed pretty hard too. And in fact, this game, C, the Contra Adventure, was probably the most negatively reviewed Contra game yet. Critics everywhere were surprised as to how Konami would greenlight another Contra game that totally failed to live up to the original titles. Interestingly, this would be the last Contra game Appaloosa Interactive would work on, because both of their games were really not well received. But regardless, it is an interesting footnote, so to speak, in gaming history. After those two games, Contra would return to Konami-centric development with the release of Contra Shattered Soldier for the PS2 in 2002. This would return a number of the original Contra game designers, and because of that, you would see a dramatic increase in the overall quality of the game. This one was a fully 3D game. It had polygonal graphics everywhere. But rather than create a 3D navigation-centric world, they would use those 3D graphics in a two-dimensional presentation. So it would result in the release of a fairly traditional classic Contra title, albeit using the power of the PS2 to have supercharged visuals, especially in comparison to its 8 and 16-bit ancestors. They would also change things up a bit more from prior releases. With Contra Shattered Soldier, the game would have multiple endings, just like Contra Hardcore, but those endings would now be dependent on how well you played, as opposed to having a branching narrative that had player choice mixed into the overall experience. This game would also do away with power-ups entirely, and instead would give players an arsenal of 3 permanent weapons, each of which could be charged to fire an alternate shot. At this point, you might be wondering whether returning Contra to Konami development, or returning it to Konami to actually develop a game with 3D graphics but in a two-dimensional kind of style, would result in better critical praise or overall response than the prior two 3D titles. And if you thought, yeah, that has to be the case, well, you would be right. This one was very well received by both critics and gamers alike, and would be followed by another PlayStation 2 Contra title, which was also developed by Konami, entitled Neo Contra, once again for the PlayStation 2, in 2004. This one would be another Konami-developed game, but it would now shift to full 3D gameplay, played from an isometric perspective, kind of a tops-down angled perspective. Very different than the traditional Contra formula of that side-scrolling kind of experience. For this one, despite being Konami developed, gamers and critics still didn't prefer this to the more traditional two-dimensional side-scrolling styled Contra games. This one got very mixed feedback. It wasn't bad for what it was, but it just didn't feel like a truly classic Contra experience. So, at this point, it's fairly obvious that in order to deliver a really good fan-favorite Contra experience, you needed two things. A traditional side-scrolling experience, plus Konami as the game's developer, because every time a developer other than Konami touched the series, it would fail, and every time a game in the Contra series would try something other than side-scrolling gameplay, or at least the majority of the levels being side-scrolling gameplay, it would fail. Every single Contra title released that used that formula successfully was actually a critical success, and would also sell well with players. If you had a Contra title with one or both of those features missing, well, those didn't fare quite as well. Despite that now understood formula, Konami would decide to entrust development of the next mainline Contra experience to an external company yet again. Only this time, that game would be a true return-to-roots kind of experience, with two-dimensional graphics, side-scrolling, and over-the-shoulder gameplay, and pixel art-driven visuals. Just imagine if the original Contra 8 and 16-bit titles were remade to look sharper, play better, and have more features than ever before seen in a Contra title. That was Konami's goal with their next Contra game, and that's what they asked the development team at WayForward Technologies to achieve. WayForward Technologies was founded in 1990 as an independent studio focused on creating entertainment and educational games for a variety of platforms, including Nintendo Super NES and Game Boy Color, Sega's Genesis and Game Gear consoles, and the personal computer market. A lot of the company's work over the years focused on licensed titles and work completed for other development and publishing studios. For a long time, the company really didn't have any new intellectual property that they themselves owned. That is, until the release of Shantae for the Game Boy Color in 2002. Shantae was a side-scrolling action-adventure platformer with some unique elements that mix in a bit of an RPG-light kind of experience. In the game, you play as a half-genie, and that game would consist of a game world with a lot of cool features, especially for platformers. The game had a day-night cycle with stronger enemies appearing at night, very similar to the Legend of Goemon, or Goemon's Adventure, I guess it was. Mystical Ninja 2, starring Goemon. I can't even remember the names of the games that we've covered, but very similar to that game, where at night the enemies would become stronger. You also, with Shantae, would have the ability to visit towns to purchase items and gain new abilities by defeating enemies. Similar kinds of experiences from an RPG perspective. Certainly not an RPG-heavy kind of perspective, but a little bit beyond the traditional platforming kind of title. As you played the game, you would gain different shape-shifting forms to tackle different obstacles and also gain new skills. There'd be a ton of mini-games included throughout the experience. There were unlockable dungeons, and beyond all, there was just an overall charming two-dimensional cartoon-like aesthetic that felt perfectly at home on the Game Boy Color's portable-sized screen. Shantae would receive a strong critical response, with many individuals believing the game to be one of the best Game Boy Color games ever made. Commercial performance, however, that one, not so great. It did sell out of its first production run of 20,000-ish copies, but a second production run was never ordered. Now, you might ask why that would be, because for all intents and purposes, the game was a critical success. But the fact is, around the time that it was released, it would actually end up being one of the last Game Boy Color games to ever come out on the market. Because by this point, the Game Boy Advance had already released. And gamers, typically speaking, when you get a new console, you want the new stuff. You don't necessarily look back at the older consoles. And that's exactly what happened to Shantae. You didn't want to play a Game Boy Color game now that you had a shiny new Game Boy Advance in your hands. So that ultimately impacted overall commercial performance. Despite the lack of sales, though, this is one of those games that would achieve a cult following in later years. And even in the midst of its original release, it was pretty obvious that WayForward was onto something with their genie-driven platforming title. After Shantae, WayForward would work on a number of other games over the years, with the release of the Nintendo DS in 2004 and its unique dual-screen design being something the company really wanted to experiment with. Their first thought, as you might expect, would be to bring a Shantae title to the DS. The only thing is, no publishers were interested given the commercial performance of the first game. When you have a game that only sold 20,000 copies despite being a critical success, that doesn't necessarily endear yourselves to the developers and publishers that are trying to get that out onto a new system. Now, WayForward would still use internal Shantae assets to experiment with the Nintendo DS, and they would release several well-respected games on both the DS and the Game Boy Advance. Though, as with WayForward's pre-Shantae gamography, most of those games were tied to other licenses, like Mattel's Barbie, Marvel's X-Men, DC Comics' Justice League, and Nickelodeon's SpongeBob SquarePants. There wasn't a whole heck of a lot of new intellectual property coming out from WayForward Technologies. Despite not having a major hit during that time, it was widely known that WayForward had a talented staff capable of great things, as evidenced by their work on Shantae. All they needed was a publisher who would let them put their own spin on a popular intellectual property. And that is exactly what would happen when Konami contacted WayForward and entrusted them with the Contra license, as the two companies entered into an agreement to create Contra 4. WayForward and Konami knew that the Contra titles of recent years weren't really the same as the original games that put Contra on the map. They wanted Contra 4 to be a return to the series' roots. So WayForward took that idea and they ran with it, returning to a traditional pixel art styled two-dimensional experience with side-scrolling levels, and for the first time since the very first Contra title, over-the-shoulder base levels. I find it incredibly hard to believe, and I didn't even realize this, but there were no over-the-shoulder base levels in a Contra game other than in the original Contra. That is, until Contra 4. Contra 4 would also feature various weapons, each of which had an upgraded form, climbable platforms similar to the 16-bit era Contra releases, and would, most interestingly, use both of the DS's screens as a means of heightening the action, literally presenting 2 screens worth of levels to traverse and bad guys to defeat. With those 2 screens, the game would also include a grappling hook that made vertical traversal quicker and more cool than simply jumping from platform to platform. So, they had the core gameplay already defined, and that core gameplay was very similar to older Contra games. Beyond that core gameplay, though, they would also include a bunch of additional features. They would have an arcade mode with 3 different difficulty levels. They would also include a challenge mode consisting of 40 different minigame challenges designed to present different scenarios to players, and would have a ridiculous amount of unlockable historical content, including screenshots, descriptions, interviews, and characters covering every single Contra game that had been released up to this point. Many levels and enemies within the game would even be callbacks to prior 8 and 16-bit Contra levels, making this the Contra experience. Or at least, that's what WayForward and Konami hoped would happen as the game released on the Nintendo DS in November of 2007. So the question is, would all of that effort result in something better than recent Contra releases? Well, the short answer to that question is yes. Yes, it would, as Contra 4 would be very well received across the entire critical community. It was declared to be a return to form for the Contra series, and would end up winning a number of industry awards, including Best Action Game of the Year, as well as Best Revival, proving that finally, Contra had returned to action gaming superstardom. It would even be named one of the top 25 Nintendo DS games ever created, which, when you consider that the Nintendo DS had almost 3,000 officially released titles in North America alone, getting into the top 25 is a pretty big accomplishment. It would also sell reasonably well, with 300,000 copies sold worldwide. It wouldn't be a blockbuster, but certainly it would be one of, if not the highest-selling WayForward title that was ever created, and not too shabby if you compare it to the rest of the gaming population. After Contra 4's release, several other Contra titles would come out, like Contra Rebirth in 2009 and Hardcore Uprising in 2011, both of which would utilize traditional side-scrolling gameplay to great effect, and solid reviews, while Contra Rogue Core in 2019 would try to reimagine Contra as a twin-stick shooter and would, similar to every other time Konami attempted to diverge from the traditional Contra formula, not be as well received. WayForward itself would have an opportunity to return to the Contra series in 2024 with the creation of Contra Operation Galuga, which was effectively a remake of the very first Contra title, complete with a ton of bells and whistles and additional content, similar to the company's own Contra 4 release from 17 years prior. Reviews of that title are admittedly a little mixed, with many claiming that it is a faithful recreation of the original title, but perhaps not enough beyond that to justify its purchase price. Regardless, it's good to see that Contra is still in the public spotlight even today, and I remain curious as to what the future holds for the venerable run-and-gun action series. As I sat down to play Contra 4, however, one question remained front and center in my thoughts. Was Contra 4 truly a return to the traditional Contra formula and gameplay, or was it yet another Contra offshoot that failed to capture the excellence of the original games in the series? That was the question that I set out to answer as I sat down to begin playing Contra 4. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Contra 4 today versus when it was released almost 20 years ago. Contra 4 is, like many run-and-gun shooters, a fairly traditional implementation of an action-oriented platforming game, The way it works, as it does with many run and gun games, is you have a number of levels that you have to progress through. A number of them have horizontally scrolling levels. Some have vertically scrolling levels where you have to climb up from platform to platform. A lot of times you're assaulted by numerous enemies coming from the left, right, up, down, diagonal, and every other direction. You have to get through those enemies, hopefully without being hit, because a lot of run and gun shooters have one-hit kills or at a minimum very little life bars in order to progress through a level. And then eventually you face mini bosses in the middle of levels, and finally main bosses at the end of levels. Eventually you progress through all those levels, you face the big mean main boss, and beat the game. That is effectively the traditional kind of structure of a run and gun shooter. And the fact is, Contra 4 does almost nothing to evolve on that formula. Its gameplay is as traditional as it comes, for the most part. There are some differences. So you might be wondering, what value does playing Contra 4 actually bring into your life? Why should you sit down and play Contra 4 instead of any number of other run and gun shooters or any other games in general? What is the secret sauce about Contra 4 that makes it something delicious? Well, I'm going to tell you, because not to get too far in front of our overall review, but Contra 4 is a remarkable game. The thing is, though, that level of remarkableness did not foist itself upon me as I started beginning to play the game. This is not something where you sit down, pick it up, and automatically think it is a classic. It takes a little bit of time to grow on you, and I'm going to explain exactly why that is as we talk through the rest of our review. Anyway, Contra 4, just to go over the general structure of the game, they have several different modes in Contra 4 that you could potentially explore as you play the game. The first is the arcade mode. Arcade mode is your traditional Contra experience. If anybody ever played the original Contra game or any of the other two-dimensional side-scrolling Contra games, you know exactly what you're going to get in this mode. You have 3 difficulties you can select between, with easy, normal, and hard. Now, in a lot of games, those difficulties really only change the overall structure of how many lives you might have, or maybe how much damage an enemy might do, or things like that. Well, the thing is, with Contra 4, it's a one-hit, one-kill kind of game. So adding additional damage to an enemy really isn't going to do anything. Nor is really taking away lives, because, well, it's a one-hit kill game. I mean, that would make it more difficult, but that's not interesting. That's not an interesting change to the overall gameplay. No, what happens in Contra 4, there are differences, by the way, in the number of continues that you get. So Contra 4 does have some continues that you can use if you end up losing or failing as you're trying to move through the game. But the main difference in difficulties in Contra 4 are the enemy placements and the enemy speed. Meaning, if you picked easy difficulty, you'd be walking around an environment with enemies that fire slowly, that projectiles with much slower paths, and enemies that just move around the screen not nearly as quickly as what you might be accustomed to in a normal Contra game. There's also a difference in the enemy placement in the levels. Some levels where you would have additional enemies or you'd be waylaid on all sides by enemies, it's just not there in easy mode. Easy mode is actually an incredibly friendly introduction to the game. The thing with easy mode, though, is that you cannot fully beat the game in easy mode. It only gives you 7 out of the possible 9 levels that you'll eventually progress through if you want to truly beat the game. So there is a little bit of a restriction in easy mode. But as far as an introduction to the game, that is where I would start. Unfortunately, that is not where I started when I started playing Contra 4. I started playing in normal mode because when I play a game, I almost always play the game in normal mode because I figure that's the default difficulty the developers want you to play. So I figured that's going to be what I go for. Let me tell you, now I'm not a gamer that plays a ton of run and guns. I like run and gun games. I've played Contra series. I've played a bunch of different games over the years. I do enjoy the overall run and gun experience, but I'm not the kind of person that goes out and buys every single run and gun game that's out there. That's just not me. So I have some experience with run and gun games. I actually did a whole episode on the original Contra a couple years ago. So I have experience with this formula. When I sat down to play normal mode for the first time, I thought the game was absolutely awful. I mean, I was so ticked off at the game. I expected to be able to go in and maybe get a few levels on my first normal mode playthrough. I recognize the way you play run and gun games in general is you have to learn each of the levels, you have to learn the enemy placements, you have to learn the enemy movements and mechanics and the boss encounters and mechanics until eventually you build up enough memory and muscle memory to beat the game without having to use up all your lives or all your continues. So I did not expect an easy experience when I sat down to begin playing Contra 4. But I did not expect a ridiculous level of difficulty just playing on normal mode, and that is what it felt like to me. So like I said earlier, I wanted to play this game on the Nintendo DS, on the actual console itself. So this is actually on real hardware. And as I'm playing the game, I could not get a grasp on it. I would die from shots fired off screen. I would not see where enemies were coming from, and I was just not having a great time. Part of the reason for that is actually one of the game's biggest innovations, which is the fact that because this is a Nintendo DS game, the game utilizes both the top and bottom screens on your Nintendo DS. That's not just a navigational feature, that's not just a cool addition to the overall visuals, it actually dramatically impacts your overall gameplay. What used to be the kind of experience where you just have to focus on a single screen for where enemies are coming from or where projectiles might be firing at you becomes decidedly different when you add a second vertical screen that you have to worry about. A lot of times I'd get hit by a bullet fired from above me and I just wasn't paying enough attention to the top screen to really be effective in the game. And at the time when I started playing it and I felt such frustration around that overall difficulty, I thought to myself, this whole DS thing, the way they implemented it for Contra 4 is just ridiculous. It's meant to be something impactful, but it's impactful in the wrong way. It's making me dislike the act of playing the game. As I often do, though, I've got to push through that because I wasn't about to put Contra 4 down and say, it's not for me. I'm going to put it on the shelf and I'll focus on another game for a different episode of the podcast. That's not my style. If I start playing a game for the podcast, I am going to play the game. I'm going to beat the game. I am going to talk about the game. So I went back with additional resolve to play the game and try to understand and try to really grasp all the mechanics and use all of the features that the game gives me, hopefully to my advantage as opposed to my disadvantage. I will talk more about that dual screen setup and whether it truly becomes effective in a little bit. But suffice it to say, my first experience with the game was not a shining star kind of thing. And then there's the hard difficulty mode, which, oh my. Hard difficulty mode is incredibly challenging. Oh, I should also mention that there are different enemy types that you can potentially get in some of these levels. And some of the enemy types do take more damage in order to defeat. And different difficulty modes may play around with some of those enemy types and increase the bullet sponginess of some enemies. That's a feature I actually don't like quite as much, and I'll talk about why I don't like bullet sponges in a little bit as well. But the hard mode here is truly diabolical and requires a degree of precision and learning and muscle memory that you have to spend hours playing the game just to be able to beat the very first level. It is a very challenging experience if you want to play the game on hard mode. Anyway, outside of the arcade mode, which has those 3 difficulties, there's also a challenge mode. Challenge mode is perhaps the most unique addition to the game. We're going to talk more in depth about challenge mode later on, but the way it works is you have a set of 40 different bite-sized challenges. And within those challenges, you might have one of several different criteria that you have to complete in order to defeat that challenge. So as an example, one type of challenge might be pacifism, which means you have to progress past a portion of a certain level without firing any bullets. You don't even have any bullets. You just have to get through the level, avoid enemies, and get to the end of the stage. Or you might have a game mode called Enemy Blitz, where a bunch of different enemies come at you from all directions and you've got to survive that wave or those waves of encounters. There's a bunch of different challenge mode features, and we'll talk all about them later on. But let me tell you, that is a very interesting, fairly challenging, but ultimately very dynamic addition to the game. And then beyond those 2 gameplay modes between arcade and challenge mode, you also have a ton of unlockables. And a lot of these unlockables focus on development, behind the scenes kind of stuff, pictures. They talk about the whole lineage of the Contra series. You all know the way I feel about video game history. So having all of these unlockables available, including interviews and all that kind of stuff, was awesome. Anyway, that's the general structure of the game. You have arcade mode, you have challenge mode, and you have unlockables that you can acquire by playing those different modes in the game. So at this point, I want to dive a little bit deeper into arcade mode because I talked in general about the structure of the game and how it plays out, but I didn't talk about the individual levels. And the reason I want to talk about the individual levels is because this game feels like a pseudo remaster / evolution of a lot of the prior Contra games that we talked about earlier. There are levels here that if you've played the Contra series, you will very clearly see where those inspirations come from. So let's talk through each of the levels because the way this game works and the way the levels work is so naturally progressive from a difficulty perspective, regardless of what difficulty you're playing on. This game has, at the end of the day, a really smooth difficulty curve, both in terms of the difficulty settings as well as just the way the game is laid out and the levels are laid out. So let's talk through each of the levels you'll encounter in the game. First level is the jungle level. This was the level that when I first started playing it, I assumed Contra 4 was simply a remake of Contra because this first jungle level is almost exactly like the jungle level from the original Contra. It has the same music. It has the same general structure. It has the same boss fight. This felt like a true remake kind of experience. And that's why when I first started playing the game, I just assumed, oh, they took Contra, they updated the graphics, they added some new sounds and new audio, and off they went. They made Contra 4 a remake of Contra. That's not the case, as we'll learn as we continue going. Stage 2 is the laboratory. This is actually a fairly cool stage, even though the first time that I played it, I absolutely despised it. It's a two-part stage, which is interesting. The first part, you are wandering through, you may have guessed, a laboratory. And in that laboratory are a bunch of alien creatures and zombie-like menaces that shamble forward and around and try to get at you and defeat you. Those things are not that bad. They're kind of bullet spongy, but at the end of the day, those zombie things, they're cool. The thing that's irritating is the aliens. And the aliens have very interesting movement patterns. Sometimes they will dive diagonally at you. Sometimes they'll come out of a chute above you or like a little opening, a hole in the roof above you, and they will ruin your day. They run right at you pretty darn quickly. The biggest menace is when aliens are climbing on the ceiling and the walls, and they kind of do a diagonal dive at you that you don't see because, as I was talking about with the fact that this is a DS game and uses the two screens, sometimes you lose sight of the enemies that are coming at you. That's actually a flaw to the DS design, which is there's a portion of the game screen that you cannot see on original DS hardware. As the enemies are traversing from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, or from the top screen to the bottom screen, you lose sight of them as they pass through the bezel of the Nintendo DS. When you're looking at a projectile that's facing or that's firing in a generally straight direction, okay, no problem once you get acclimated to using both screens to navigate the game. When you're talking about an alien which has fairly random movement and you might not even see what direction that movement is starting from without seeing the enemy before the bezel, like they might start their movement as they're passing through the bezel, which means you see them coming down straight from the top screen, and then when they emerge on the bottom screen, they're going diagonally at you, which, let me tell you, is awful. One of the cool things about the laboratory, though, is that there is a ceiling you can grab onto and kind of monkey bar your way across the level at different parts, which adds a whole new dimension to gameplay well beyond what the original Contra provided. And I know there were other Contra games in the series that included that kind of movement mechanic, but Contra 4 does it really well. I should also mention, by the way, that because of the dual screen nature of the game, you're also equipped with a grappling hook, and that grappling hook can attach to things above you that makes traversing those vertically themed levels or getting onto the ceiling of certain levels much, much simpler. If all we had to worry about was the laboratory section of the laboratory, though, that would be one thing. But after you pass through the laboratory with all of its aliens and zombie-like creatures, you then face a cliff that you have to climb up. And this cliff is almost directly taken from, once again, the original Contra, where you have to jump up a series of platforms vertically, avoiding boulders that might spawn and fall at you, as well as defeating enemies along the way, en route to another boss fight at the end of that stage. That boss is not quite the same exact boss from the original Contra cliff stage, but it's pretty close. It is really darn close to that boss fight. Anyway, you beat that boss, you move on to the third stage, which is the first base level, and it is an over-the-shoulder level. I had mentioned earlier that over-the-shoulder levels really only existed in Contra 1. They didn't exist in the other Contra games. So this is a true return to that original Contra formula. And let me tell you, that base level is pretty darn awesome. All of the over-the-shoulder levels in this game are pretty awesome, if you have the right weapon. And at this point, it's probably a good idea to talk about the weapons in the game, because part of the overall formula for Contra and other run-and-gun shooters is what kinds of weapons do you get, and what is their overall power, and which ones are the favorites as you move through the game. The first gun we'll talk about is the machine gun, which is pretty much exactly what you would expect. It lets you fire a rapid-fire volley of bullets at your enemies, making short work of most enemies in the game. The cool thing about all of these power-ups is that each one has a second power-up, an upgrade that goes along with it if you collect two of the same power-up, which means you can collect a machine gun and then later in a level, you might find another machine gun power-up, you pick it up, and now you have a super machine gun, which is literally decimating. The machine gun upgrade is one of the most powerful weapons in the game, bar none. And it is supremely satisfying to start firing that machine gun at an enemy and watch him blow up into little bits. Well, not real. I mean, it's not a violent game in that respect, but it is so fun shooting at a boss that would otherwise take minutes to defeat and drop him in literal seconds. The machine gun is incredibly powerful. It's not quite my favorite gun in the game, but it's pretty darn close. The second gun is the spread shot. The spread shot I have gone on record as saying it is one of my favorite guns in all of the Contra series. And in Contra 4, it remains one of my favorite weapons here. The spread shot is effectively a shotgun kind of shot, where if you have a single version or a single upgrade, not upgrade, if you have the spread shot in its base form, it will fire 3 projectiles in a spreading pattern out in front of you. If you have the spread shot upgrade, it will shoot 5 of those projectiles, which, similar to the machine gun, is absolutely decimating to your opponents. If you get right up close on a boss and you're firing 5 projectiles into its face at the same time, it is definitely going to go down really quickly. The spread shot is similar to the machine gun, one of my favorite weapons in the game. I've got to say the spread shot is probably, the machine gun and the spread shot probably tie for second place with all of the weapons in the game. They're really good weapons, especially fully upgraded. Then you have the homing shot, which sounds like it would be awesome because it fires a missile that literally homes in on your enemies. So you could be shooting just off the side of the screen and it will find the enemies for you and defeat them. The thing is that the homing shot, and even in its upgraded form, it just doesn't feel that powerful. It doesn't feel nearly as powerful as what a normal rocket blast would feel like or should feel like. I'm assuming the reason for that balance is because if you had the true power of an explosive rocket launcher that homes in on your enemies without having to actually aim, it would be pretty overpowered. So I'm assuming that's why they pulled back a little bit on this particular weapon. The other thing is that the pathing of the projectiles as you shoot them is not all that great. Each of the missiles will kind of circle around a little bit before it tracks to a target, and it may not be the target you want to hit, which sometimes opens yourself up to a little bit of danger because you might have an enemy really close to you that's progressing towards you. You fire the gun and it thinks, oh, I'm going to shoot that alien off in the corner of the screen without attacking the one that's right next to you. So a little bit trickier to use. Not my favorite weapon in the game, but can be useful in a pinch. Then you have the crush gun, which does away with the homing shot. It doesn't home in, but it is in fact a missile launcher. And that gun is my favorite gun in the game because the splash damage of the crush gun as the missiles hit the target, it does a lot of splash damage. The missiles themselves are insanely powerful. When you fire that thing and it hits in the center of a screen and a number of enemies flail about and die, it is supremely satisfying and powerful. And that's actually where it comes into play. The biggest area where the crush gun comes into play is in the over-the-shoulder levels, because as you're firing forward, that missile will oftentimes hit the walls of the base as you're walking through that base. The splash damage here is good enough so that you can literally stand in the center of the screen or crouch in the center of the screen, fire missiles without a care in the world, and it will defeat every single enemy, obstacle, little sensor that you have to defeat in order to move forward in the stage. It'll defeat everything without you even having to wear worry about it. Occasionally, you may have to stand up if you need to fire up, like if there's a sensor or a turret that's above and you have to do a jump shot kind of thing. But the crush gun does so much damage that you're only going to expose yourself to danger for a very short period of time. This is by far my favorite gun in the game. It does wonders on bosses and normal enemies. It is just amazing. Its upgrade allows it to fire even farther than its fairly limited range when you don't have an upgrade, which means an upgraded crush gun is truly devastating. My favorite weapon of the game. My least favorite weapon of the game is the flare gun, which is pretty much par for the course because I don't think I liked the flare gun back in the original Contra either. This is the gun that fires off the circular fireball kind of projectiles, and it's just there. I mean, it's useful in it's useful in one stage later on in the game, the city stage, where actually it's useful in a couple stages. But anyway, the flare gun is the kind of gun where it kind of spirals the fireball as you fire it out. The only time this is really useful is when you have enemies slightly offset either to your side or above or below you, where you can't really get the angular direction of the other shots or the other weapons that you have in order to hit those enemies. If you have the spread shot, you're good. If you have the homing shot, you're good. If you have the crush gun, you might miss. If you have the machine gun, you might miss because you can only point in a certain direction diagonally, a 45-degree angle. So if there's an enemy that's slightly above you, but you can't really hit them, and you're hanging off of a steel wire, well, the flare gun is actually your go-to in that kind of situation. Really limited use, but at the end of the day, it is useful in a couple situations. Ultimately, though, my least favorite weapon in the game, and its upgrade just turns it into a big fireball that gets shot out, which, okay, I guess that's cool. And then the final gun in the game is the laser gun, which is kind of, sort of, I'll say, third, fourth place. It's, if the crush gun is my top weapon, and the machine gun and the spread shot are tied for second, then I suppose the laser gun is my third place finish for the weapons. The laser gun is exactly what it sounds like. It shoots a bunch of lasers in front of you, and it's not like the laser gun from the original Contra, which was fairly limited and you had to watch out how many times you pressed the button because it would stop the overall spread of the laser. In here, the laser actually fires away from your weapon, so it's kind of like a laser machine gun. And actually, its upgrade is exactly that. It turns it into a laser machine gun, which is pretty darn awesome. That does a ton of damage to bosses. I'm not sure if it does more damage than the traditional upgraded machine gun or not. I'm not sure if it does more damage than the crush gun or not. The crush gun is only limited by the fact that your overall rate of fire is a little bit less. The laser gun, when fully upgraded, and the machine gun, when fully upgraded, it fires a ton, and it just does absolutely massive damage per second. So I'm not sure which one is ultimately the most damaging weapon in the game, but I will say that the laser gun fully upgraded really does feel pretty good to use. It just doesn't feel quite as impactful, though. The machine gun, when it hits something, it makes a really satisfying sound, and you know you're making damage, or you know you're giving that enemy a lot of damage. Same thing with the crush gun or the spread shot. The laser gun kind of just pew-pews a little bit, and it doesn't feel quite as impactful. So maybe that's just psychologically what's affecting me with that one. Still a good gun at the end of the day, but not ultimately my favorite. Anyway, let's go back to the levels. So we were talking about the base, and I got off on a tangent talking about the weapons because if you get to the base level and you have a crush gun, it's effectively game over for the enemies because you can literally just shoot the wall, have the splash damage kill everybody, and off you go. If you don't, though, it becomes much more challenging. Nothing too crazy in this first base level, this first over-the-shoulder level, but it is a lot more dangerous to have to move around and actually stand up to fire at the different things that are on the screen. Shouldn't take too long to get past that base level, though. It is pretty darn easy. And then you get to the harbor, which is another side-scrolling stage, which is set in, it's set in a harbor. And you have to progress from left to right to get through that overall stage until you get to a brand new section of the stage after a little mini-boss and some run-and-gun section with some enemies that continuously stand up after you shoot them down, which are super irritating. You get to the later part of the stage where you have to start climbing up what is effectively a rocket launcher apparatus. And by rocket launcher, I mean a gigantic go into space rocket. You eventually jump up there. I guess it's probably more of a missile, I guess. Maybe it's not going into space. It's probably just firing on somebody. So you're jumping up this missile firing thing. And eventually you have to jump onto the missile itself. And you have to traverse that missile as different handholds both appear and disappear on that missile while you're getting fired at by other smaller missiles. If this were in a movie, this would be the most cinematically over-the-top action experience you will probably have ever seen, because what is more action-oriented than hanging onto a missile, jumping from handhold to handhold while you avoid other little missiles that are getting fired at you? That is the kind of stunt that not even Tom Cruise would attempt. That would be an awesome cinematic experience. In the game, though, this takes some getting used to, and my general default attempt at this as I was jumping from handhold to handhold was I felt like I had to press up when I would get near one of the handholds to be able to grab on. That is not the case, and actually it causes an input that makes you oftentimes fail to grab the handhold in general, which is really not a great feeling, because a lot of times, especially when I was first playing through the game, this is the level and the part of the level that would eat up a ton of my lives. You get extra lives fairly frequently in the game. As you get additional points, you get certain high scores, and you get to accumulate a lot of lives. If you get really good at the first few levels of the game, which is pretty easy to do if you play it for a couple hours, you could have a good 8-ish lives going into the harbor. And you might actually get to that missile portion of the stage with 8 or 9 lives currently stocked up. Until you get used to jumping from handhold to handhold, and this might have been a me problem, it might have just been my own psychological issue that had me trying to press up to grab onto the handholds when you didn't really need to. But until you get used to that, this part of the stage will deplete your lives dramatically. Until you get used to it, this is going to be a true hurdle to overcome. Eventually, you will overcome that, and then you'll come to the boss of the stage, which is fairly easy. It's a big robot that kind of punches its fists down at you, and then it shoots out a couple of missiles that you have to avoid. You defeat those hands, you defeat its head, and off you go to the next stage. Now, I should mention at this point the difference in weapon power when it comes to fighting different bosses, because this is going to be one of the first bosses, besides the second stage boss, which is pretty darn bullet spongy. A lot of the bosses in this game have a ridiculous amount of hit points, and you cannot see what their hit points are or how you're damaging those bosses as you're fighting them. Other than if pieces of them start exploding, you know you're doing a good job. But that is heavily dependent on which gun you have. I've talked about all of the guns and power-ups in the game already, and each of those guns, for the most part, are fairly usable in almost every situation. They may not feel the best, but they definitely help. Your base gun, your general default gun, without any power-ups, without any upgrades, is so not powerful that you will never, ever, ever want to use it. And you will especially never want to use it against a boss, because trying to use an unupgraded gun and a non-power-up kind of fire mode, you are going to take so much time trying to defeat these bosses. This is one of my biggest critiques about the game. Even after playing the game for hours upon hours and getting real used to the game and beating it several times and beating all of the challenges in the game, even after doing that, I hate the default gun. It is so not powerful that it takes a significant amount of time to defeat any bosses. And because it's taking so much more time to defeat the bosses, you open yourself up to additional damage and danger to lose additional lives. It feels absolutely awful. Anyway, do not use your default weapon if you can help it. If you do end up with the default weapon, all I can say is good luck, and I hope you're good at dodging all of the different projectiles and enemies that get thrown at you, because it's just, from my perspective, it's just not all that fun. Anyway, you will eventually get past the harbor. That brings you into the ocean stage, which for my money is probably the most irritating stage in the game. You start by being on a jet ski of sorts, and underneath you are a number of enemies that start moving across the screen and then jumping up at you. And conceptually, that sounds okay. But these enemies, unless you have a powerful upgraded gun, will emerge from the water below you, and they will fire a number of projectiles at you. And sometimes, based on where you are on the screen, you may not be able to dodge one of those projectiles, and you may not be able to shoot one of those enemies before they fire a projectile at you, which means effectively instant death. That's not the worst part of this stage, though. The next part, after you get past this initial opening, is there's these two dragon snake creatures that come out from the bottom of the sea, and they start trying to attack you as well. They attack in an arc sort of pattern, or a circular kind of pattern. And there are some moves that they make where if you don't get in the right position at the right time, and by the way, it is kind of difficult to be able to judge how they're moving and what attack they're going to do. If you can't get in the right place at the right time, you will absolutely lose lives, and in the process, you'll lose any upgrades you might have, because I didn't mention it before, but every time you die, you lose whatever your equipped gun is. You also, by the way, can carry 2 guns at a time. So it is possible, if you have a particular gun or a couple of guns that you like, it is possible to come back and still have one of those other guns available to you. But you really don't want to die if you can help it. Once you get the gun set up that you like, try to hold on to it as much as possible. I know that's obvious, but it bears mentioning anyway. Those 2 sea dragon snake creatures will eventually die. They take a ton of damage. If you have a good gun, they go down really easily. If you have your default gun, you might as well restart now, because I'm not even exaggerating. This is one of those sections where it's very, very challenging to get past without losing a bunch of lives. And then you go to another area where they have other enemies that fly off in the air and fire homing missiles at you, which, okay, I mean, it's not super bad once you get used to it, but that's still pretty darn irritating. Then it moves on to another section of the stage where you have to avoid enemies that fire up at you from in the ocean, which is fine. Those are easy enough. And then you go into probably the easiest boss of the game, where you literally only have to stay on either the left or the right side of the screen. It follows a very simple pattern, and you just have to shoot it in the eye multiple times. That's probably the easiest boss in the entire game, following one of the more irritating levels in the entire game. So a little bit of a reprieve. Then you move into the factory level, which is the second over-the-shoulder level. The same exact rules apply here as what applied in the base level, which is if you have the crush gun, you are golden. If you don't, might be a little bit more challenging. The boss of that stage is actually a really cool encounter where you have an alien that pops up that fires some fire beams, like a flare. It breathes fire at you in a specific pattern that, once you learn how to avoid it, is really easy to avoid, and the enemy becomes really easy to defeat. But then he starts chasing after you. You start running towards the screen away from that enemy as he starts coming after you in the base level. And that is a really cool sequence. I'm not going to lie. That is a super cool sequence to have in the game. And the fact that you're basically being chased by this enemy until you eventually are able to slam a door and cut its head off. Sorry about the spoiler, but it's a really cool encounter. This is a really cool boss. It's probably my favorite boss in the entire game, simply because of that encounter. After that, you move on to the city level, which is, I guess, a fairly traditional kind of level. There's not really much to talk about here, other than the fact that as you move through the city, there's going to be times where you have to grapple up to steel beams above you to climb across the city from the rooftops. There are some irritating enemies here, particularly a bunch of slugs that will sometimes climb across the metal wires that you're climbing across. And if you don't have the flare gun, this is one of those areas where the flare gun is actually useful. If you don't have the flare gun or a spread shot or something that can hit enemies that are offset either above or below you, you might have a little bit of a challenge with this one. So that's an area where the flare gun actually does help. But overall, the city is kind of a fine level. There's nothing too crazy about it. You have to learn it a little bit, and there are some enemies that jump out of windows to try to get at you, but ultimately you'll get past it. The thing is, that is the end of your playthrough if you're playing on easy mode. To get to the final 2 levels of the game, you have to be playing on either normal or hard mode. So assuming you're playing on normal or hard mode, the 8th level is the Alien Hive, which is the final over-the-shoulder level in the game. Similar to the other 2, if you have the crush gun, you're in a pretty good spot. Although I will say that this level in particular is a little bit different because the aliens that spawn at you and start moving towards you are sometimes difficult to hit. And there are some areas where aliens will run across the top of the screen, drop down, and then run either left or right at you, which means you have to jump over them as they're coming at you. And sometimes the crush gun doesn't really hit them the way you would expect. So this is another area where the flare gun does actually help. I would say the crush gun is still the way to go in this level once you get used to the alien movement, but the flare gun does provide a purpose, or does serve a purpose here. The final boss of that stage is really easy. You just have to avoid a couple of projectiles that fire at you and keep shooting at the alien heart, and then you're good to go. And that level's over, and you're on to the Harvest Yard, the final level of the game. And the only thing I can say as you first get into this stage is holy hell. This is a ridiculous stage. This has so many enemies, projectiles, areas to climb up, obstacles to avoid. This is death incarnate. The first time you get to Harvest Yard, you will not survive. I guarantee you will not survive. It starts off with a mini boss fight, which once you learn it, it's fine. But then the rest of the stage is absolutely brutal. It is not I would say it's the hardest level in the game. It is not the most irritating level in the game because you can get through it with enough practice and memorization, but it is definitely the hardest level of the game. And then finally you get to the big bad boss, which is a big alien eye with actually multiple eyes and all sorts of stuff and a heart and everything else that you would expect to blast away in a huge alien menace. There are some patterns that you have to learn in that fight. The nice thing is that boss will frequently drop some additional upgrades and power-ups for your guns, which is great. If you've died and you don't have any other power-ups, you can pick up a power-up right there in the fight, but can also be detrimental because sometimes those upgrades fall from the sky. You don't have enough time to get out of the way without taking some sort of damage, and you end up picking up an upgrade that replaces something you really wanted to use, which can be a little irritating. You should eventually be able to get past that boss, and with that, you have beaten Contra 4. These stages, I should say, I think that they are very well designed, and the overall progression through the game is super smooth, and once you get used to the overall gameplay, it will feel amazing to play. It does take a while to get used to that, though. I mentioned how hard this felt when I first started playing. I really disliked the game. I thought that Contra 4 was being difficult just for the sake of being difficult. And then, as it always happens, something clicks, and you suddenly realize that this is an amazing game that requires your attention, respect, and dedication to actually beat and overcome, which eventually I did. That was the arcade mode. There's also the challenge mode that I mentioned earlier, which has several different types of levels. There are 40 levels in all. You can either play Bad Guy Blitz, which has a special bad guy type included in the regular stages as multiple enemies go at you and you have to defeat them all. There's a mode called Gunplay, which means you're either using a prototype gun, which is the homing shot upgraded, or the classic laser from the original Contra, which, like I mentioned earlier, is not my favorite weapon. There's also the pacifism kind of stage, which we talked about earlier. You're unarmed. You have to move through that without actually defeating enemies, just avoiding them. There's Rematch, which is just a singular boss fight that you have to beat once again with a certain set of upgrades that the game gives you. There's a mode called Mutt Hunt, which is where you have to get through a series of stages and you have to defeat dogs that spawn and move in there. There's a certain number of dogs in each stage. You have to beat them all before they get away. There's Speedrun, which is exactly what the name implies. You have to get through the level as quickly as possible and try to beat the time limit. There's also a Friendly Fire mode, which has levels that have civilians interspersed throughout them. You have to defeat the bad guys without hitting the civilians. There's an Accuracy mode, which is a gameplay mode where you have to really fire as accurately as possible. Yes, it's kind of in the name, because at the end of the stage, you get assessed by the percentage of hits that you had versus the percentage of misses, and you have to have a certain percentage of hits in order to progress further. And then there's low ammo mode, which is a mode where you don't really get all that much ammunition. You've got to conserve and figure out when you have to use those bullets instead of when you want to, which means it's kind of a mix of pacifism and accuracy. You want to be able to hit the enemies that you shoot at, but you're not going to want to shoot at every single enemy because if you do, you're going to run out of ammunition. Those are the different types of levels within the overall challenge mode that are spread across 40 distinct stages. And I've got to say, I loved the inclusion of challenge mode here. Challenge mode felt like a breath of fresh air. Some of the earlier stages are not too bad. Some of the later stages are pretty darn challenging. And what I found was that I played arcade mode. I didn't actually beat arcade mode. I went back. I played challenge mode. I went through all of the challenges, and in the process of playing the challenges, I actually got better at the game so that when I went back to play arcade mode, I was finally able to beat the overall experience. I don't know if that's the expected course of progression for the game where you use challenge mode to hone your skills and then eventually go back and beat the arcade mode, or if it's meant to be more of an arcade mode then challenge mode kind of thing. But regardless, for me, it really worked. It worked to go into arcade mode, get used to the game, the way it works, the overall mechanics, the grappling hook, the dual screen kind of gameplay, then go into challenge mode, go through all of those challenges as much as possible, which, by the way, as you're going through each of those challenges, every 5 challenges you beat, you unlock something new, which is awesome. I love games that have unlocks in them, like additional artwork or dev commentary or interviews and stuff like that. So that was really a nice addition that made me want to continue to play challenge mode beyond just experiencing the mode and getting better at the game. And then after I beat challenge mode, I went back to arcade mode and I had my way with it. And I finally had beaten Contra 4. There's a lot more to talk about with Contra 4, specifically around areas like the graphics and the sound and all that kind of stuff, which we're going to do in a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have gameplay videos on YouTube. We didn't have a pervasive internet. Back then, all we had was word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Contra 4 for the Nintendo DS, the back of the box says guns, aliens, spread shot, carnage. Use your upgradable weapons to blast through 9 intense levels. Engage in 1 or 2 player dual screen combat and unlock loads of hidden bonus content. And then there are a bunch of screenshots on the back of the box, and that is literally it. That is the only thing that appears on the back of the Nintendo DS case. And I've got to say, even though it is probably the least text or some of the least text that I've ever seen on the back of the box for one of our episodes, this one totally sells me. The game looks amazing. The graphics look great. The one screenshot on the box is from, it looks like it's from the jungle level. I'm almost positive it's from the jungle level, which automatically makes it cool because the jungle level in the first Contra is iconic. So yes, this game absolutely sells me, even though the back of the box, if taken in isolation, is kind of bare. There's not a whole lot there, especially in terms of text, but the overall presentation and the fact that I know this is a 2D Contra game makes me want to buy it anyway. So yes, the game does sell me, or the box does sell me on the game, even though it's not what I would consider to be the best possible box for this particular game. Anyway, we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Contra 4 are wonderful pixel art 2D graphics that are truly upgrades of every prior Contra game that came before it. It looks amazing. The graphics are phenomenal, completely reminiscent of the original Contra, but decidedly better given the greater power of the DS in comparison to the NES. It feels familiar, yet fresh. Animations, meanwhile, are absolutely perfect. The action never slows down, no matter how many enemies are on the screen. And there are a lot of enemies that will come at you and a lot of projectiles that will be fired at you. And the gameplay never slows down. This is one very impressive looking action title. I loved the design of the enemies. I love the design of the players. There are multiple players you can choose between to go through. There's like a character select you can go through and pick which character you want to play as. I really only played as one, but I'm sure that there's reasons for playing with the others, short of just the cosmetics. But regardless, it all looked good. It was a really good looking game. Moving on to the sound and music, even more than the graphics, all of the sound and music in Contra 4 is absolutely perfect and draws inspiration from prior Contra tracks while still forging its own unique path. It all sounds amazing to experience. The sound effects, meanwhile, are also perfect, with the right combination of bombastic over-the-top sounds coupled with great environmental audio that makes this feel like a balls-to-the-wall affair from beginning to end. But perhaps the best part of the entire auditory experience is the fact that if you try to play the first arcade level, the jungle, in hard mode, you will get a remixed version of the original Contra's jungle theme, which is, to put it mildly, freaking amazing. It is so good. I can guarantee you that one of the songs I included here is that song because it is so good. I can't say enough good things about the music. It is absolutely phenomenal. Moving on to the story, Contra 4's story is set smack dab in between Contra 3 The Alien Wars, which was the Super Nintendo game, and Contra Hardcore, which is the Genesis game. So it's almost like a bridge title between the Super NES and the Sega Genesis. After beating the Red Falcon alien menace, a new alien entity named Black Viper has decided to attack humanity. So, as you might expect, it's up to you, veteran Contra commandos Bill Reiser and Lance Bean, two awesome names, alongside two other commandos, Mad Dog and Scorpion, two even awesomer names, to tackle the alien attackers and defeat them, hopefully once and for all. This story is about as perfect as you can get for a Contra game. If you like 80s style action film plots, then you're going to like this one, because there's not much behind the scenes here. There's not much under the surface. This is right there in your face, pure 80s action awesomeness, and it truly is great. I mean, look, the story is super threadbare. If you're going in expecting an Academy Award winning storyline, you're going to be disappointed. But for the style of over-the-top action experience Contra 4 gives you, this narrative is just what the game needs. Moving on to gameplay and controls, we already talked quite a bit about the overall gameplay of the game, so I'm not going to rehash all that here. We didn't talk too much about the controls, but they are pretty simple. You have a dedicated button for jumping, a dedicated button for shooting. You can hit one of your shoulder buttons to switch between the two weapons that you might be carrying at any point in time, and you can also hold your other shoulder button to be able to stay stationary and not move around as you shoot, which honestly is probably a control mechanism that I should have used more than I did. I ultimately didn't stand around all that much. I did the running and gunning because that's what you do in Contra. But I do appreciate its inclusion because there are some platforms that are fairly narrow, and there are some areas with enemies that spawn very, very frequently and quickly, and you have to clear them out before you can jump from the platform you're on onto another platform, at least if you want to do that safely. So there is a use for that mechanic. It's just something that for me, for whatever reason, I decided not really to use. But anyway, other than that, those are the controls. Oh, and of course you also have a button for your grappling hook to be able to jump up or to pull yourself up to whatever ceiling or roof or other structure that might be above you, assuming that there is something that you can grapple onto and then climb across. So those are the controls for the game. The D-pad is used for moving around the environment, which works perfectly. The touchscreen is not used in the game at all, so we haven't talked about a ton of Nintendo DS titles. In fact, I'm trying to remember if we've talked about any Nintendo DS titles before. I'm not sure that we have. The touchscreen in Contra 4 is not used at all, other than if you're outside of the actual core gameplay, whether you're outside of arcade mode or outside of the challenge mode, you can navigate menus using the touchscreen and pick challenges and do the different unlockable stuff on the touchscreen. Other than that, it is not a touchscreen enabled game, at least to the best of my knowledge. Maybe it is in some capacity, but for the most part, the touchscreen is just used as another visual screen as you play the game. So anyway, that's pretty much the gameplay and the controls. I don't want to rehash all that or focus too much on that, but there are a couple things I want to foot stomp as we go through the rest of our discussion. The first thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, that just like every other Contra game and just like most other run and gun shooters that have a degree of difficulty, you will have to dedicate some time to actually getting better at the game. I mentioned that the first time I sat down to play this, I absolutely hated it because it just felt hard for the sake of being hard. That was my own issue. That's something I had to overcome. I had to spend some time to learn the game, to learn the levels, learn the mechanics, learn how to look at both screens at the same time, because that did not come naturally to me. It didn't come naturally to me in this game. I've played plenty of other Nintendo DS games, and I didn't really have that issue. But I think because of the way the action was structured in this game and the fact that you had to basically expand your overall visual perspective, horizon, your overall field of view to include that vertical space to be able to watch for enemies or bombs falling or projectiles being fired at you, it was a little bit of a shift. It was admittedly a little bit of a shift for me. That might not be an issue for you, but it was for me, and it took me a little bit of time to get used to the game. Once I did though, wow. Wow, was it awesome. I loved this game. I loved the quality of the levels, the way the enemies were designed, the boss designs. I loved how the challenges gave you these bite-sized pieces of levels to play through with specific criteria and restrictions that you had to follow. I love that. I also loved the difficulty ramp up, meaning how you could progress from easy to normal to hard difficulty, and it felt like a natural progression, and each difficulty level felt like it really did provide an additional sense of challenge without being just full of bullet sponge enemies or additional damage that you can't mitigate. It was a true difficulty ramp up in terms of skill, not tedium, and that is a big deal. The easy mode was a great way to begin getting used to the game. Normal was a pretty big step up, but totally doable, and hard is a huge leap. Admittedly, I did not dedicate the time to the game necessary to beat the game in hard mode. I did beat the first hard mode level, which was the jungle with the remixed Contra 1 music in it, just because I wanted to enjoy the Contra 1 music in that level. But other than that, I was good. I was good with beating normal. Maybe I'll go back at some point and beat hard mode, but I don't feel a need to do that. I feel like I got everything I wanted to out of the game, and it was an amazing, amazing experience. Now, I do have to mention, though, that I just said that the difficulty, when it ramps up from difficulty level to difficulty level, there is no tedium. It's not about introducing more tedious encounters. It's about testing your skill, which is great. But I do have to say that if you don't have any power-ups or special guns in your inventory, if you're trying to play the game with your default gun, the game becomes incredibly tedious. Well, let me take that back. Boss fights become incredibly tedious. Remember how I said that there were no bullet sponges really in the game? Well, that's true as long as you're firing an explosive missile into each boss's face. If you're trying to use your default gun though, oh my god, does it take forever to kill these bosses. Even on easy mode, it takes forever. The speed of attack and the relative lack of firepower is a huge detriment here. So much so that I would suggest the game might have needed a bit of a balancing pass to bring the default gun up a couple levels, and perhaps reduce the damage of some of the most crazy weapons, like the upgraded machine gun, which is effectively death incarnate. Note, I did love the feeling of power that you get with upgraded weaponry, and I wouldn't want that power to be reduced. But if it meant that the default weapon might be made just a tad less tedious to use, then you know what? I'd accept a bit of a downgrade to the special and upgraded weapons. That's how bad the default gun feels to use against bosses in the game. Ultimately, though, this critique is relatively minor because the gameplay loop is as addictive as the original Contra titles, and the quality is perhaps some of the finest Contra action I have ever experienced. This is a top-flight game, and once you learn the game, it becomes an immensely enjoyable experience just to play. I even decided to play the game again after I beat it, just because it was so fun to pick up and play, beat, and then move on about your day. This is one amazing game. So, what is our verdict on Contra 4? Well, it's probably not a surprise, but Contra 4 is definitely the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. It is an absolutely stellar two-dimensional action platforming experience. It's a throwback to 8 and 16-bit classics of the past, with a fresh coat of paint and some really cool design decisions that make the game a joy to play. There is a learning curve here, but once you overcome it, oh boy, are you in for a treat. Absolutely everyone should play this one, which is why I can safely say that Contra 4 deserves its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time for our weekly challenges. These are focused, of course, on Contra 4. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on Discord on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel to get your coins. The first challenge is to simply complete 5 challenges within the game. Those are the things that are marked by things like pacifism or bad guy blitz. Those challenges, complete 5 of them, post proof of that accomplishment, and you will earn 1 coin. The second challenge is to beat the game in easy mode. Like we talked about, easy mode is 7 out of the 9 levels. The difficulty is totally doable. If you can beat the game in easy mode, you will get 2 coins. And then finally, for 3 coins, complete 20 challenges. That is half of the challenges in the game. If you can do that, you will earn 3 coins. Once again, please post proof of those accomplishments out on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Contra 4. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Little Nemo, the Dream Master. So definitely write in if you have any feedback on that game and get your comments read on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Little Nemo, the Dream Master. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.